And there is a lot of myths surrounding, the fact that disabled women cannot have children. Not all of them cannot have children also. But there is a lack of awareness, a lack of general, even scientific awareness. That conversation is not had most of the time.
Hi friends, this is Read and Write with Natasha podcast. My name is Natasha Tynes and I'm an author and a journalist. In this channel, I talk about the writing life, review books, and interview authors. Hope you enjoy the journey. Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Read and Write with Natasha. Today, I'm very happy to have with me Dr. Shahad Alshammari. Dr. Shahad Alshammari teaches literature and holds a PhD in English from the University of Kent, Canterbury. Her works include Literary Madness in British, Post-colonial and Bedouin women's writing, Notes on the Flesh, and the latest one, which is Head Above Water. Her research areas include disability studies and women's studies. Dr. Shahad, welcome to the show. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you, Natasha. Very kind introduction. I'm really excited to be talking to you today.
Yeah, me too. So I just read your book, Head Above Water. I really enjoyed it. And so if you can tell us and tell the readers and the listeners a bit about the book. What is this book about? It's available on Amazon. It's called Head Above Water. And also, why did you write it? Why did you write such an open, honest memoir? So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's always exciting for an author to talk about their baby. So Head Above Water is actually narrative nonfiction. I like to think of it as an illness narrative, specifically as a genre, an illness narrative, rather than just a memoir. It's a very specific genre, illness narratives. So I am actually living with multiple sclerosis, which is a neurological illness that affects many young people, usually from the ages of 20 up to 40, roughly speaking. And it really affects your ability to move, your ability to speak. So really, it affects all of our experience of the world. And I didn't see much representation of narratives about disability or even about Arab women specifically living with illness. And so I felt the need to share my narrative, not just because I wanted it to be healing for me, but I wanted other readers to feel they could kind of take something from that experience. I think we don't think about illness or disability unless we have it or we're living with it. It's something that we don't really think about until we get sick, which is interesting because most of us will get sick at some point, whether through old age or through a random diagnosis. A lot of us actually will end up with some sort of illness or disability. And it's a part of the human experience. It's a huge part of our human experience, even I think more than race, more than gender. We see a lot of narratives about racism, about sexism, about our experiences as women, but our experiences as people living with illness or disability, it doesn't seem that there's much of that out there. Mm-hmm. And so I think I really wanted to sort of change that narrative. I wanted to include my voice, hoping that other people at some point will also share their narratives. I teach English literature, but I also teach a lot of Arab women's fiction. And I always look for narratives that are a bit more, let's say, realistic to the area that we're actually living in, instead of tragic narratives of the Arab woman or Middle Eastern woman as always suffering and needing to be saved. I think there are more narratives that should be taught. And because I'm always looking for text to teach, I also love writing, and I'm a writer, so I tried to bridge that gap. I wanted to kind of share something that could later be taught in classrooms or could be read by book lovers looking for more representations of Arab women. That was my mission. I think my mission was personal, but also academic. It was really a desire to change the books that are out there. And that's what Head Above Water tries to do.
Fascinating. So, do you think there's a still stigma in the Arab world against women with disability, women specifically? Because, like in the book you mentioned in the beginning, where there's this guy who was interested in marrying you, and he hid the fact that you were sick from his family because of the stigma. I guess things are changing, but like how men always want to, at least in the Arab world, want the perfect wife, the untouched, the brand new wife, and uh, do you think that this stigma still exists because of the push of to get married and to have the perfect wife?
I think there is a lot of stigma, yes. And I think I see this specifically for women more than men. A lot of men with disabilities live, semi-normal lives, and they have, higher chances and opportunities in the workplace as well as marriage opportunities. And it's something that, unfortunately, even in the media, that's something that's a narrative that's constantly repeated. So you have the character in a wheelchair, and the male character wants to marry her but is embarrassed of her being in a wheelchair and has to kind of deal with that in front of his family. So I found that was a common narrative, that a woman with a disability was seen as inferior. Again, not just because she's not perfect, but because of the disability itself. So just like there's a lot of expectations on women, having to have certain weight or having to look in a certain way. There's a lot of ageism also. Women who grow old are seen as unattractive. And there's all of this horrible stigma. I think disabled women have to suffer doubly with that. So they're dealing with gender, they're dealing with age, and then they're dealing also with disability as a factor. So society definitely has a lot of the stigma still. I see it not just in my personal life. I see it with friends that I know, people that I know, disability support groups that I go to. I see it in the media. Even when the media tries to change it, it's still that same narrative. The able-bodied man is doing her a favor. If he does decide that in fact he will marry her, even though he will have to kind of explain and defend his position in society, he's seen as a hero rather than someone who has just fallen in love. He's seen as a hero, that he has made this choice when he could marry any able-bodied woman. And I was reading about this the other day, just a random, just a random article. It was saying that a lot of couples who are, they call them interabled now. So someone who has a disability and someone who's able-bodied, they still get frowned upon in Western societies also. So it's something that I hadn't thought about, but there might be more resemblances than we think in disability culture, whether it's Western or Eastern, so to speak. It seems that there's a lot of stigma surrounding what kind of love relationships get supported, what kind of love relationships get frowned upon. Is the disabled woman seen as a burden? But if it's a disabled man that we're dealing with, is it not as much of a burden? So it's a lot of difficult, I think, topics to work with. And a lot of these experiences are not written about, they're not shared openly. And I think that would be a whole area of narrative fiction, but also of research. And, I aim to look at it also through my research, because I do a lot of disability research in the area. So I try to talk to people living with disabilities and different privileges, different social class, so that I can see where the intersections are. And it's surprising that it seems to be the same narrative regardless of privilege. Living with a disability as a woman really does have a lot of oppressive, let's say, factors that play into how your life is shaped and how you're received by people.
Do you think it has to do with childbirth? Like the idea of disabled women might have a less chance of bearing children, and especially in the Arab world, where children is a kind of huge part of the marriage deal. Do you think that's plays a huge part in that?
Absolutely. I think because we place a lot of value on, mothers and mothering,
Mm.
and the value of a woman is closely tied to her ability to be a mother and to reproduce, rather than anything else. That's where most of the
Mm.
focus is on. And there is a lot of myths surrounding, the fact that disabled women cannot have children. Not all of them cannot have children also, but
Yeah.
there is a lack of awareness, a lack of general, even scientific awareness, that conversation is not had most of the time. So there's a myth that they just can't, that everyone can't, which is not the case at all. But definitely, I think a big part of it is the ability to mother. Also, again, just reading about this from even the Western perspective, there tends to be an idea that disabled women are not attractive, nor are they capable of being sexual or childbirth or all that stuff, almost seen as an infant.
Mm.
And so I think there's so many factors that play with it. So needing to be mothered rather than becoming a mother. So there's this idea that you're always seen as a child, that you need to be taken care of. So it's definitely, I think that plays into it. And I see it in many societies, definitely not just Arab societies.
What about the representation and the language in Arabic specifically when it comes to disability in the Arab world?
Mm.
Like I know some friends and people I know is even using the term disabled among
Mm.
people with disabilities can be a bit sensitive, and there's a lot of discussions around this topic. And how is that playing in the Arab world and in Arab media when it comes to, I guess, representation in the media and the way they are portrayed?
Well, to be honest, there's still that debate about what to call people with disabilities.
Yeah.
You see a lot of these mistakes happening on social media. They're referred to as individuals with special needs, ذوي احتياجات خاصة. And this causes a lot of misunderstanding. It's deemed to be the more respectful term, but then individuals with disabilities actually answer and say the actual term is ذوي الإعاقة.
Okay.
And then you have in the UAE, they call them people with determination,
Okay.
the Wil Himam, which is completely different from the rest of the region.
Yeah.
So I think that debate is still happening when it comes to language, and there's a lot of vagueness about what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. And I think the problem is disabled people themselves are not being included in the conversation.
Okay.
So, there's a lot of kind of policymakers and decision makers that claim this is the right term. It's more, it's more respectful. I've had many conversations like this with students, with faculty members, professors who feel the term special needs is more appropriate, and which is a huge problem, of course, because people with disabilities don't feel they have special needs. Because when you say special needs, احتياجات خاصة, you're basically locating the problem in the person with disability. You're saying they will be a burden on society. You're going to need to treat them special. You're going to need to give them a special attention, special care, something special.
Yeah.
So the usual answer in the Western context is, I'm not special, and I'm just like you. I need accommodation.
Okay.
Over here in the Arab world, I think we're still trying to figure out the actual terminology, and there's differences in different countries with, how do we actually deal with it?
Okay.
Now, from what I know, the correct term, the UN has actually placed this as individuals with disabilities, and in Arabic, it's the same.
أشخاص ذوي الإعاقة.
Exactly, where you put the person name first. It's people-centered terminology.
Okay.
وليس معاق. We don't just say disabled. Disabled what? So it's individual with disability, أو شخص ذوي إعاقة. أشخاص ذوي الإعاقة. So I think that this is where language and the law and even education and schools, it all needs to come together to change that. First, you change the language so that you can change the myths, and then that you can destigmatize the myths that are still going around. And so I try to do that on a very personal level, even in school, even in my classes. I tell them we don't say special needs. Do you know why? And so we start a critical conversation so that we can break it down and start thinking about even the words that we use, how they can be disempowering rather than empowering.
Aren't you worried about using it in especially the word الأشخاص ذوي الإعاقة, it can be used in a derogatory term, especially the word معاق. And I've growing up, I'm talking about a long time ago in the 80s and the 90s, it was used to insult someone as a derogatory term. So aren't you worried that this can be taken out of context if this term was adopted?
I think that's already what's sad to hear. It's not. You say it's a long time ago, but sadly, it's still the same. A lot of people still use the term as an insult.
Yeah.
It's easy to throw around. I think just like a lot of words, even in the American context, they're still being thrown around. Whether for sexuality or race, they're used like that. But what a lot of these, especially these African American authors and activists and all of these activists claim that to be able to destigmatize and to reclaim that word, then you need to start using it about yourself so that it doesn't hold that power over you. Now, I do correct it, of course, when they say معاق أو معاقة. It's not like that. هو شخص ذوي الإعاقة. So still don't ignore the person part. I think, maybe I have a bit more, patience with it than some people might. Maybe it's because of my teacher background. I teach language, so I have a bit of patience into trying to correct, how people use words and what it actually could mean. But of course, I'm aware that there's a lot of negative connotations. And once I actually start this conversation, I start asking, why are these negative connotations there? Again, because people with illnesses or disabilities are seen as inferior to people who are able-bodied. Just like Black people were treated as inferior to white people, as Arabs were treated as inferior to the West, and so on. So it's a lot more intersectional and common than we think. The disability experience is not that different from other experiences.
And what about journalists, Arab journalists? Are they being trained on, as someone with background in journalism and training journalist, I'm curious to see if there's any training when it comes to using the exact terminology when it comes to the disabled community. Yeah. Please correct me if I'm using the wrong term.
To be honest, I've seen a lot of mistakes still. I see mistakes, not just in the media. I see mistakes even if you are trying to, go to a parking that's specifically for disabled individuals. It might say something like handicapped in English, which is a term that is no longer being used at all in most parts of the world. Or it will say something like, don't look at my parking space, look at my burden in Arabic. So it keeps this myth going. Okay. So not just in journalism, but everywhere you look, actually. I think the UAE are doing their best, and they probably are doing better than in most parts of the region. The terminology is almost always people with determination. There's an actual law. You cannot say anything else other than that term. And I've seen that at the airport, at festivals. So it's nice to see also a general agreement about the term.
Oh, that's nice to hear. What about the accessibility aspect in the Arab world? I interviewed an author on the podcast who's Palestinian. He had a spinal disease, and he's in a wheelchair, grew up in a wheelchair. And he was telling me how he grew up in the West Bank and was under occupation, and then he moved to the US. And he's still in a wheelchair, and has a PhD now, and he wrote his biography. And one of the things that he noted was he saw an improvement in access for people with disabilities. So where do you think we, and I know every Arab country is different. We cannot lump them all together. And so where do you see when it comes to, if someone wants to go to the theater, someone wants to, how is accessibility going in countries in the Arab world?
I think, to be honest, and from what I can see in the wealthier side of the Arab world, there's a lot of accessibility when it comes to spaces, architecture, buildings. That's almost never a problem. Almost everywhere you can, get to a restaurant. You can see a bank machine that's specifically for people who are living with blindness. So you see a lot of these things. They are there. I think when it comes to accessibility, especially for physical disabilities, I think we're doing well. When it comes to invisible disabilities and things that you cannot really see, or even mental difficulties, whatever they might be, even things as mental illness, depression, anxieties. There's a lot of vagueness about how to actually deal with access when it comes to that. Even with students, how do we actually deal with a student with autism, or how do we deal with a student with severe anxiety and cannot actually present? So we are not trained in terms of how do we actually deal with them? How do we actually accommodate these different needs? So I think in terms of physical accommodations, because of the wealthiness of the countries and the good architecture and the buildings, that's covered. It's what you don't see that's still kind of lagging behind. So I'm glad to hear also the story about the author you just mentioned. I would love to read his work, actually.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'll send you all the link. And maybe I'll put you in touch with him. And this is going to take me back to something that I found fascinating about you, which is you have a PhD in madness among women in literature. And I've been thinking a lot about this, and and you also mentioned that how people, when you told them about your diagnosis, it's all in your head. Women are drama queens, and it reminded me. I think if it was based on a movie or a play, which is called Gaslight. I'm sure you know.
Yeah, it's popular.
How he basically drove his wife crazy, mad by changing the light.
Yeah.
And I've been thinking a lot about this story, and where do we stand? I know you have it in Literature in Madness. Why did you decide this topic specifically? And do you think that, that there's still some sort of tendency to underplay women's issues and lump it as madness, and also drive women to the degree of madness?
Absolutely. I think, like you, I was curious about it. I was thinking about it. Why don't we see these characters as actual characters that we can empathize with instead of being afraid of them? So it all started with, I read a book when I was in high school, actually, not even in undergrad, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. And there's a mad woman in the attic, and we see her only in one page of the book. And she's terrifying. And I grew up really scared of her and scared of what it means to be, locked up in an attic because you're insane. So as I grew up and I started reading a bit more, I had this interest in, where are these characters? Why are they labeled as scary, as dangerous, as mad? And then I realized that, like you said, sometimes there's a tendency to downplay women's emotions, but there's also a tendency to kind of make them into pathologies, make them into monsters, rather than just saying, well, this is something that is probably temporary. Maybe it's just something, after childbirth, like postpartum. Doesn't mean that you will be a monster forever. Again, they tend to, the medical community, throughout history, it has done that. So when the medical community does that, of course, fathers, brothers, husbands, the patriarchy, will follow whatever the medical community says. And then you have the literature that comes out in the same kind of narrative. Women are dangerous. And again, this goes back all the way in history, yani, from the idea of hysteria and women, for the womb, as we know, we're born as hysterical. And yeah, so it's something that really fascinates me, the amount of oppression, the amount of different parts of in society that all seem to kind of want to agree on a narrative that silences women and their experiences and their emotions. And I think it all starts with the medical community. That's where it begins.
It's funny because even like until now, you watch like whatever Netflix and sitcoms, that there's always this character of the middle-aged crazy woman in bed with a bottle of wine, and this is basically what is the current cultural definition of a middle-aged woman, depressed and over drinking and shouting at her kids. It's even if you think of it as maybe in the past it was the woman that was locked up, now it's the alcoholic woman who's shouting at her kids and doing crazy things. So I don't think honestly the image of the crazy woman is gone, and it's I think it's still there, sadly. And can you give us examples in literature where that theme of like major characters where they portrayed women as completely crazy, and how that affected, the generation of readers who are reading about this?
So I think it all really begins with Jane Eyre, which is by Charlotte Bronte, the classical novel. It's been read for years and years, and nobody has ever really paid attention to the mad woman who is actually, her name is Bertha. We don't even know her name. She's not that important. The white Jane, the proper Jane, is the one who's actually given a lot of attention. And then years later, decades later, actually, another author, her name was Jean Rhys, wrote the prequel to Jane Eyre, in which she looks at actually Bertha's narrative, the mad woman's narrative, and the book is called Wide Sargasso Sea. Yeah. And in that book, she actually looks at, or the narrative, she looks at how, well, it started with her name being changed from Bertha to Antoinette. So identity change because of marrying into a different society, an English society, and having to kind of change her name, her dress code, her style, the way she speaks, all of it drove her away from her identity. So she gives her really a narrative. But in literature, we've had all kinds of, since the beginning of time, you've had Medea, for example, the monstrous woman who murders her children. This is a play by Euripides, ancient Greek play. She murders her children because Jason wants to exile her, and he wants to remarry. Basically, he's done with her. So again, we look at her as a monstrous figure. A lot of critics don't empathize with her. She's seen as a monstrous figure because she kills her children. And this narrative of mothers who kill is still actually very dominant today. Medusa, just off the top of my head, there's so many of these scary mad women. Even in folk tales that we have, even in Kuwait, we have a lot of these folk tales. She will come to kids if they don't go to bed early around 7 o'clock. So there's always a scary woman who will come for you, and she's mad and bad and so on. Oh, wow. So it's I think it's really fascinating that it's all over. There's almost like a universal myth going on.
Actually, now you make me feel bad because I'm writing a novel. One manuscript that I put aside, there is a mad woman.
There you go. Yeah.
But and in my books, not published yet. I mean, she's just like crazy and walking in the street in her nightgown every day. She just walk in the street, and all the neighbors knows that she's crazy. I think in my manuscript, I tried to give her a backstory and why she was driven to craziness. But now I think I need to do a better job of the backstory and give her more of a character instead of that. I think I myself was kind of influenced by the stereotypes, even though I'm a woman, ironically, but I think I was also influenced by the stereotype of the mad woman in the novel. And I felt like I needed a mad woman character
somewhere there.
somewhere there to make
Yeah.
my manuscript interesting and edgy. But yeah.
Well, actually, Natasha, a lot of critics tell you a lot of authors use this technique. They either insert a mad woman figure or a disabled figure as metaphor. So they usually symbolize something else rather than the actual experience. There's no backstory. So
Okay.
you have a guy with a scar, you have someone without their arm, an amputated leg, or you have a mad woman who doesn't speak in the text. So there's
Yeah.
usually some kind of symbol of the breakdown of society used in that character, which is problematic really, because we don't get to see the backstory as you
Yeah.
said.
Yeah,
Rather
it's
than
like they're
just
using
using
as
them.
prompts, not at
Props,
actual.
exactly.
Yeah, it's not an
Yeah.
actual. This is fascinating discussion actually, and yeah, it makes me think about my own writing and how I was influenced by what I'm reading.
Yeah,
Fascinating.
absolutely. Because we really, we take all of this in and we don't think about it unless you suddenly wake up one day with a disability, or
Mhm.
you suddenly wake up blind, or you can't hear, or something has gone missing. You won't just wake up one day and suddenly you're a man or suddenly you're a child, but you might wake up one day and suddenly you're not you physically.
Yeah, yeah,
And then you start thinking, well, what have I done to destigmatize or to actually further stigmatize people who are living with illnesses or disabilities.
mm.
And even, for example, I was telling my students, the Lion King, the villain is called Scar. The
Ah,
villain himself, he's actually reduced to just the scar on his face. Most villains tend to have some kind of disability, or they have some kind of illness, or they look bad. But the good ones, they don't look bad.
yeah,
And
like the
it's
pirate. The
yeah,
pirate
yeah,
is missing an arm and an eye.
absolutely. Evil. So evil is
Oh
closely tied
wow,
to that.
wow,
Yeah,
that's
it's in the fairy
fascinating.
tales. It's everywhere. We've grown up with these fairy tales. So it's really hard to move away from that in your own writing or in our own thinking. It's
Oh
hard
wow.
work, really.
What about multiple sclerosis in the Arab world? I'm gonna focus. Okay, all right. I'm not gonna sound like like an Orientalist, but I'm gonna like focus in the country
Yeah,
where you live. So you live
yeah,
in Kuwait,
yeah,
and your background is Palestinian and Kuwaiti, correct? Like
yes,
you're yeah.
yeah.
So where when it comes to multiple sclerosis, where you live, whether it's in Kuwait or through your family in Palestine, how is it perceived? Do people understand it? Do people downgrade it, saying you look fine? I mean, like here, looking at you from Skype, you look gorgeous. Amazing. There's just like looking. I don't think I would think you're somebody with disability, and I'm ignorant because I follow the same maybe stereotypes of what people with a disability should look like. So how is it going now in the Arab world when you describe it?
I think it's the same as a lot of places with invisible disability. So what you see is not always what you get,
Mm,
honestly. But we're so used to what you see is what you get. So you see someone in a wheelchair, immediately you think, okay, then they have a disability, they have the right to use that parking. Or
yeah.
you might quickly empathize, or you might feel pity, or or you might be inspired, different kinds of reactions. But because you're using your eyes, you see it, so you believe it.
Yeah.
With MS, there's so many different faces to it. And I keep trying to say, especially now with my book coming out, I'm not the face of MS. There's so many different faces. There's so many different people who are in wheelchairs, some people who can't speak, some people who can't see, some people who look just like me, some people who look better. And there's so many different varieties. What tends to happen is a lot of people feel it is a mystery. So they might say something like, maybe it's not that bad, or are you exaggerating it?
Mm,
You might get questions like, but you look very healthy to me. You do some sports, so the pain can't be that bad.
mm,
So the problem with these kind of comments is they are very suspicious. And I think one issue that people with illnesses and disabilities have, I have this issue too, is the disbelief. When you are not believed or validated for your pain, kind of to tie into the mad woman's
The mad woman,
narrative
yeah.
also. If you're not believed based on what you're saying you feel, then this is really, really another form of oppression. So if I, being able-bodied, or being in a position that is healthier than you, if I say something like, well, I don't think you deserve that parking space, or I think you can walk those 10 steps. You are young. I'm older than you. If I can walk, then you should walk. All of this kind of plays into more oppression.
Mm-hmm.
Because I end up having to say, no, it's something that you can't see, but there is still pain. Sometimes pain is invisible, and sometimes these conversations I will have them with older people, because older people a lot of times they are taken to kind of really, they are taken with respect, and a lot of, we take them very seriously. So if an old person says to you, I'll take the elevator, you won't say, no, come on, let's go down the steps. You will respect it, especially in Arab culture.
Yeah.
Now, of course we will take the elevator, but I've had that happen where I'm told, come on, let's not use the elevator, let's use the stairs, let's get some exercise, although I had just asked and requested for us to use the elevator. But I feel that because I'm not a senior yet, and I'm not, in that spectrum yet, I'm not taken as seriously as if, someone older, even not living with a disability, would say, I need to take the elevator or the escalator. So it's really interesting because ageism also plays into it.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about these different experiences of what we take seriously, and what we believe and what we don't believe.
So in the book, you had a discussion with your friend Hannah, and Hannah tells you maybe you should like carry a note or something. And I started thinking about people with diabetes who wear a bracelet. Is there anything like this for people with multiple sclerosis? Do you think it's good or bad to be like, visibly identified, especially when people cannot see it? Do you think that would work?
I think it would at least start the conversation. So sometimes there's an orange ribbon for MS, but most people don't ask you what it really means. But I do have that on my bag, and I carry it around, but it doesn't really start much of a conversation. So we all know, for example, breast cancer, there's a lot of awareness about that, and you see the ribbon and immediately, exactly what it means. But most people don't know that the blue ribbon is for autism, the orange one is for MS. So again, unless
I don't know, for example.
it's because again, if you're not living immediately with it, or you don't have a friend with autism, or a daughter with autism, or someone close, then it'll be something that we don't really know. But I think these campaigns, yes, they can definitely be helpful. They are, based on individuals, but also maybe larger campaigns, NGOs in the media. I think that would definitely change things, and hopefully destigmatize what it really means. Because there's a lot of confusion. With MS specifically, it's more confusing because you see someone in a wheelchair, and then in the next 5 minutes in the same waiting room, the patient's waiting in that room. One of them is, in a wheelchair, the other is using a cane, the other is using a walking aid, the other one is not using any of that. So it's hard to place a face to it. And I think that's what people struggle with.
So in the book you mentioned, again, we're going to go back to Hannah and you, that Hannah was fair-skinned and passed as white. I'm using your own words.
Yeah.
And she was not scrutinized as much as you did for using the place dedicated to people with disability. And do you think it's still the case now? Do you think people see you as like the immigrant who's breaking the laws? You don't know what you're doing, while they, immediately they think differently of Hannah. Is still that the case if you go to places in the West?
Well, I haven't been in a while, but I would like to experiment with it for sure. I'd like to see how that gets received. That was an experiment we did because we really wanted to see if looks play into it, if whiteness plays into it. And I would say I wouldn't be surprised if it still does. it was as simple as, getting accommodation or getting a table at a restaurant. If she would leave, then we would get a table faster, even though I'm the one with the cane. So it would be really interesting, who gets heard faster? Somebody who looks white, blonde, fair, and also looks able-bodied. Is that it? And definitely, I felt very invisible at many, many, many different times. And I think at the time I didn't think about what it really means, but as I've grown older, I think I've started thinking about the look that plays into all of this, and how race is part of it.
Yeah, I've never heard the discussion from how they see you as more of the immigrant who doesn't know the rules because of the way you look. I like, at least this is how I interpret it. So this is definitely, we need to talk more about this because it's really totally different perspective. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears here, and now I'm going to talk about the publishing process. So this book, you had a publisher, correct? It was not self-published. So I want to talk about the publishing process. Do you have an agent? How did you find your agent and all of that? The point of this podcast is to inspire aspiring authors and to how to get into the publishing world, how to publish their book, get the rejections, all of that. So I know you published many books before, so this was probably easy for you, but I just want to hear about your publishing journey.
Well, actually, it wasn't easy at all. So I started, my first book was self-published, and it was a poetry collection.
Okay.
And I've gone all routes. I've done the self-publishing. I've done with Neem Tree Press, which is the latest. I've done the local publishers also, which works very differently from abroad. I've gotten many rejections, so many rejections, especially for Head Above Water. Actually, it was rejected for all over. I tried so many US publishers. I tried a lot of UK publishers. I've tried German publishers. I tried all over the world. Actually, I stopped at nothing. I kept pitching various agents, and the response was always negative. The response was always, this is too specific of an experience. It's either too Arab, too disabled. There was always something. One of the harshest responses was, it's too narrow. It's too narrow-minded. And I was really, going for the opposite. I wanted it to be universal. I wanted it to be something we could all relate to.
Okay.
So I finally found a publisher, but it really was really, really depressing. And I really felt the book would probably at some point just stay, in a Word document and not get anywhere. But at that time, my publisher was open to submissions without an agent. And I think that's where I got really lucky. It was fate, because that hardly ever happens. And it's always you need an agent. So when the publisher herself read the book, immediately she fell in love with it. And I was the first and only person to fall in love with the book.
I fell in love with the book.
And that was so huge for me, that somebody actually saw something worthy, in the narrative. And then we started talking about it. I was going to go down the other road, which is the academic publishing road, which is very different from the creative publishing, because I also felt at least, it would find a home. But for academic publishing, it would have meant different readership, and it wouldn't reach a general audience. I think the publishing industry is vague about what they're really looking for. They say they want diversity. They say they want own voices, but then they say things like, where do you live? We're not sure if we can market you. If you live in the Arab world and you're writing in English, why are you writing in English? So there's all sorts of questions. And I think there's an idea that they want to champion diversity, but in practicality, in reality, I don't see much of it.
I think it's all about, it's a business for them. I mean, I wonder if you wrote the same book and you approached a New York-based publisher, let's say, and you lived in the US, maybe it'd be easier, except because it'd be easier for them to give you a book tour and, make, I don't know, but I think it's just interesting what you say, that, they want their own voices, but whose own voices? I mean, is it universal own voices, or is it like only, New York based own voices, or, I mean, and, I think what's happening with publishing, it has to be more universal because the world has changed. And I think there should be a need for a global publisher and I think there's few of them that I've seen. But the idea of the publishers like being in one city, the top, either like New York or London, I think it's a bit antiquated. I think we should like try to find a way of changing that, because the world is changing. And which takes me to the other question, which is the issue of gatekeepers. Do we even need the gatekeepers? Do we even need publishers now? Were we going through this torturous hunt for a publisher, and it's soul crushing? Why are we doing this to ourselves? What's the point when, we have technology now, like Amazon KDP as one example, where you can publish it, and the quality is really good, publish on demand, and it's more lucrative for you as an author to go this route, and you can hire an editor if you have the funds. And why do we even need publishers now? What do you think?
Well, I have to be honest, I did try the self-publishing road initially, and it was very fruitful. I sold so many copies with that. And as you said, there was a lot more, at least there was a lot of financial return to that. The book was accessible. A lot of people managed to get copies of it. And then I went down the traditional road because I thought this would be something that's taken a bit more seriously. There is this myth, I think, that self-publishing means, it's not by a serious publisher. And I think, I can see the benefits of both at this point, because I've done the self-publishing, but I've also received so much support from the traditional publisher, not just in terms of distribution, but in terms of publicity, which I think it's something I would have never been able to do on my own, simply because I wouldn't be listened to as an author publishing a book on my own, advocating for myself to be in the press, in the media, to get the book reviewed. If it's a good publishing house, even if it's a small independent press, which is like my publisher, they work really tirelessly, and really they work so hard at making sure that the book gets into the right hands. I think they have that experience that I had lacked when I was doing the self-publishing. But I always advocate for, getting the book out there, regardless of the way it actually sees the light. Whether you go the self-publishing road, or in Kuwait, we have something called hybrid publishing. I think it's everywhere, everywhere. And it's also a great option. I've tried that too. I feel like I didn't shy away from any of these options. And I love the fact that I got to experience, all the different contracts and the benefits that come with each.
How is the book doing, if you don't mind me asking? What was the feedback that you received? Any negative feedback, any positive? As authors, we always receive both. Well,
it's actually out May 30th, so it's out World MS Day in 2 weeks, very soon, inshallah.
Okay, so I'm the lucky one who got the
exactly. It's an advanced review copy, so you're one of the first 10 people, I think, who've read it in the world. So it's quite an honor that you're reading it and that you fell in love with it. It's good news. I hope it's a good omen. I've received a positive feedback so far from the people who have reviewed it, and a lot of different reviewers said the same thing, that there wasn't anything similar that they had read from the region about illness, about disability, about identity, and at the same time, I was not aiming for like a tragic view of illness, and not something also very inspirational, neither nor. I just wanted the narrative to actually start the conversation about disability and illness and identities. So I think I'm excited to see how it does actually in the future.
Yeah, I mean, for me, in addition to the story itself, the writing was really good. I mean, I'm not surprised they have PhD, of course, but the writing is really, really good. So,
I think that actually comes from the fact that I love poetry more than
yeah,
prose, actually. So
yeah.
I love that play with language. For me, I feel I'm always writing poetry, even when I'm writing prose.
I could see that. I mean, I could see the poetic, the poetic writing, putting verses. It's beautiful book. I mean, so before we conclude, what you're a teacher. What tips would you give to students who want to publish a book now? And you and I talked about the grueling process of rejections and all of that,
Yeah.
and it's honestly crushing. I've been through it. Other authors that I interviewed, my friends, it's really not for everyone. I mean, it can
Yeah.
it can really take you down. So,
Yeah.
what would you tell them if they really wanna take this
Yeah.
route? Yeah.
I think the first thing that we always start with is I want to write a book or I want to publish a book. But I think we need smaller steps. We need to start with I want to publish something short in a magazine or in an online magazine or an online journal. So I did a lot of that, especially over the past few years, because I was really aiming for the larger project.
Okay.
I wanted the agent or the publisher to see that I've experienced, publishing other stuff before this big project.
Okay.
And when they googled me, that they would find different projects, different writing that's out there already, that there is a bit of experience, that there is a bit of an audience, a platform. I kept a blog for so many years. Blogs kind of died down now, but I did have that. So I did have some kind of audience already, is kind of there to say that this isn't my first attempt at writing a book. And I think that really helps. So I always tell my students, pitch everywhere, send your stuff everywhere. Any call for stories, any call for anything at all, any genres, even kind of get outside your comfort zone. So some people are really kind of nervous about moving into poetry or moving into prose. It stretches it stretches your brain and your ability to write different genres. Taking workshops even online, I've taken those. They're always fun to do, and they also get you to kind of accept any kind of feedback that you get, that usually does strengthen the work, even though we feel very protective over the work. And as you said, it's not for everyone. There has to be this really tough skin, and you either really kind of give up on it or you keep going, even if it takes years and years and years. And sometimes you kind of have to settle for changing something, or changing the road that you wanted, rather than traditionally go to self-publishing. Rather than self-publishing, you decide, maybe I'll publish this in different posts online. Or so, yeah, I think bunch of little things here and there, just to keep your sanity, so to speak, as you go through the process.
Any tips for someone who's writing in a language that's not their first language, which is
Yeah,
so
absolutely. I think a big part is the editing, and finding someone that you can trust with the text to actually look at the editing. Even native speakers make a lot of mistakes as they write. So of course it is quite I think normal, so to speak, to actually need someone to look at it. I had more than one person look at it, to be honest, and I don't see a problem at all in that. Some people get a little bit touchy about it, but I think it's completely helpful to have more than one editor look at it. There are phrases that you might not even notice, that that's something you don't say, or something that maybe culturally would not be appropriate. So definitely something to consider. An editor that you trust.
Yeah. Any last thoughts, comments? Before we conclude, especially about representation, and the publishing journey and all of that.
I think that I got very, very lucky, to be honest, that the book found a home. And I hope other people find a home for their babies too. It's really important to kind of not give up on that idea. I feel like if I manage somehow to by a stroke of luck or fate or by a publisher believing in it, then I'm sure other people hopefully will find that spark of lighting somewhere. And I'm just really happy to be on the show with you, the podcast, and I'm happy that you read the book and it fell in the right hands. I hope others pick it up too. And I'm always really looking for feedback. So I'm always happy and always welcoming any feedback.
Of course, and thank you for taking the time to chat with me. I'm inspired, and I'm gonna make sure to change the character or improve the character of the mad woman in my novel. I'll show it to you to get your approval.
Of course, I look forward to it.
And for anyone who's watching or listening, thank you for listening or watching another episode of Read and Write with Natasha. Until we meet again, keep reading and keep writing.